Hello and welcome to episode 50 of the Ask Historians podcast. That's right, we are officially over the hill and I couldn't be feeling better about it. We do in fact have a tremendously excellent episode, or really pair of episodes coming at you for episodes 50 and 51. Today we will be listening to the first of two parts, looking at the history of Zimbabwe, formerly known as Rhodesia. In this episode, the first one, we'll be starting kind of slightly before, technically we'll be starting several thousand years before the Bantu migrations, but we'll be starting more substantially, slightly before the colonial era, talking about the Shona and the Ndebele, and then moving through all the way up until the late 1950s, early 1960s with the Central African Federation. As I mentioned, I'm very happy with this episode. It came out terrifically, although you can probably at some point see if you can catch when you realize that historians are not good at geography, shockingly. And, I don't know how East and West work in the Southern Hemisphere, but I think we may have gotten a little bit confused. It's an amusing moment, but just a little bit of embarrassment. And an otherwise absolutely tremendously good episode on a subject that really... Zimbabwe is one of those countries which often gets used as a symbol of a lot of things, often to the detriment of actually learning its own history. So this is one of those times that it makes sense to just kind of go back and unpack this thing that people talk about without really talking about it, and when really talking about many, many other things which are not it. So, hope you enjoyed this episode, and again, this is part 1 of 2, so cuts off a little abruptly, but we'll pick back up in the next episode and finish it out properly. So, enjoy.
Welcome to the Ask Historians podcast.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Ask Historians podcast. Today I am here with the user known as ProfRhodes, although of course he is not the long undead zombie of Cecil Rhodes. He is actually a PhD student in South African history, or the history of Southern Africa, I could say. Perhaps he could explain it better. Why don't you go ahead and give us an idea about what got you interested in this topic and your current work?
Hi, well, first of all, thanks for having me here, for letting me ramble on about my favorite topic. Essentially, I got interested in this because my family are former Zimbabweans, former South Africans. I was born to a Rhodesian mother, so it's always been a very personal topic, and it sort of came to me as a calling, I guess, when I was doing my undergraduate thesis on the unilateral declaration of independence of Rhodesia in 1965. And then as I sort of progressed up the ranks and did my master's, and as I'm now doing my PhD, it just became obvious to me that Zimbabwean history and South African, Southern African history was something which I had a genuine interest in, and it makes it a lot easier to research and write on these topics when you do have a passion for them. But I'm currently at the University of Cambridge, just halfway through my PhD at the moment, so very much in a research phase, and hopefully going to get some good, solid conclusions out of my own topic on nationalism and race in post-colonial and colonial Zimbabwe.
Yeah, so today we will be talking about colonial Zimbabwe, also known as Rhodesia. Before we get started, though, I just want to, because it often gets ignored in the fact that a lot of what we get taught in general history classes about Africa, they start with colonialism. There's no history until white people show up. But before that, there were these people in that area, and still in that area, of course, called the Shona and the Ndebele. So could you tell us about these two groups in that area?
Yeah, of course. It's a good point you make. Is there is this traditional assertion that the land before Africa, before European arrival, was empty. It was devoid. It was the dark continent. But it's obviously not true. In terms of Zimbabwe specifically, been occupied by the San people for going on to 500,000 years now. The San people are the original descendants of Homo sapiens, and the area of Zimbabwe called the Matopos Hills, which is a UNESCO World Heritage Site today. There's evidence there which shows that this region has been occupied long before the European arrival. And the Shona and the Ndebele are very different groups. The Shona are the descendants of the Bantu migrations of the sort of 2,000, 3,000 years ago. And they're originally the descendants of the Kalanga, who are perhaps most famous for Great Zimbabwe, the famous gold mining state for whose buildings the nation today is named. And Great Zimbabwe was a key trading center in pre-colonial Africa about between sort of 1270 and 1550. And it had a particularly good relationship with the Muslim traders of the Swahili coast. So you see these glass beads from China, this porcelain from Persia and so on. You see these connections to the outside world well before the British, the Portuguese traders made inroads into the region. And essentially after Great Zimbabwe begins to fade by the mid sort of 15th century, it's replaced by the Monomotapa and the Torwa kingdoms, who are essentially what the Shona come from in terms of a sort of political society. And the Ndebele are a much more recent arrival in Zimbabwean region. In the 1820s and 1830s, the Ndebele were a group of Nguni people from southern Africa, from South Africa, who were forced from South Africa after a conflict with Shaka Zulu and the sort of militarization of the Zulu as a society. And it's broadly called the Umfakane, the sort of this period of continuous warfare and unrest between sort of 1860 and 1840. And the Ndebele, under the leadership of a man named Mzilikazi, fight a battle against Shaka Zulu. They surprisingly win it. They're the only African military force to have ever defeated Shaka Zulu, which is quite a claim to fame and gave them a reputation for being strong, fierce warriors. But they realized that they couldn't withstand further retribution from Shaka, so they flee north of the Limpopo River and into Zimbabwe, where through a series of military conquests and social annexations integrate the existing Rosvi states in the southern half of the region into this Ndebele kingdom, this sort of loose allegiance of chiefdoms to a central authority, to Mzilikazi. So the situation is before the arrival of the Europeans, essentially Zimbabwe is two distinct and separate territories, with the Shona to the northeast in what becomes known as Mashona land, and the Ndebele to the southwest in Matabele land.
And Matabele is, I take it, is an older term for the Ndebele.
Yeah, to get into the semantics, Matabele is essentially the Shona word for the Ndebele. It's a difficult sort of thing to talk about because there are subdivisions of the Ndebele who still prefer to be called Matabele even today. But broadly speaking, you would talk about them in terms of the Shona and the Ndebele as the two major ethnic groups in Zimbabwe today.
Yeah, so at this time, we've kind of fast forwarded, done a very, very sprint through a few centuries up until about the late 19th century. And at that point, we see the entrance of the British South Africa Company. So go ahead and give us an idea about who was, what was this group?
Okay, well, the British South Africa Company was just one of several British companies which were active on the African continent sort of after 1870 and this emergence of a new imperialism in Europe.
And the British scramble for Africa.
Yeah, exactly. The scramble for Africa, this sort of period of when technological advances, when economic desires sort of result in this mad dash for new territory on the African continent. And, I mean, I don't want to go into too much detail about this new imperialism, but
it's a whole other subject by itself. Yes,
exactly. But one key thing which I think should be raised is that within this scramble for Africa, there's various competing elements. There's this civilizing mission and this idea of what Rudyard Kipling called the white man's burden, to help the poor or lesser developed,
which is of course also usually intrinsically tied in with a Christianizing mission as well.
Exactly. Evangelical Christianity is a huge motivation for these companies to and the European imperial powers to expand their control over the continent.
But also, they're also companies, so they have a bit of an economic orientation.
The economic, you can talk about, for example, the Imperial British East Africa Company up in Uganda and Tanzania and Kenya was comparable to the British South Africa Company. Their expansion was very much economically based, and the British South Africa Company, the BSAC, was essentially the work of one man, which is Cecil John Rhodes, who was a British-born businessman, a staunch supporter of the British Empire, and who made his money through the diamond market in South Africa. De Beers, which is the other company Rhodes is most famous for, still exists today and still dominates the diamond market. But the British South Africa Company was very much a counterpart to De Beers. It was very much a way to access new lands for mineral extraction.
Because, this area, of course, going back to Mwini Mutapa and Zimbabwe and all that, this area has been known for its gold mines, right?
Yeah, Great Zimbabwe made its fortune through the fact it had easy access to both alluvial gold on the surface, but also it was one of the first places in Africa to mine gold in substantial quantities, which made it it gave it a reputation across the continent, and especially in the sort of enclaves, the European enclaves on the coasts. They heard these rumors of lands in the interior, in the hinterland, where gold was lying on the surface, just ready to be taken. And this was very, this is very evident in the British South Africa Company's sort of stated policies in 1887 and 1888. It was one of the reasons why they were able to amass such popular support both in Britain and also in South Africa, which is obviously where Rhodes made his fortune and where he sort of made his name as Prime Minister in the sort of late 1880s, early 1890s.
Yeah, so Rhodes is down in South Africa at this point, or what is that point? British South Africa. There's still the Boer state in there, I believe, as well, right? Correct?
Yeah, absolutely. You've got the Cape Colony, which is what is the region now around Cape Town, I suppose, and sort of the western northern Capes. And Cecil Rhodes became Prime Minister of that in the 1890s, partly because he was such a wealthy individual. He was British born, don't get me wrong on this. He was very, very much a British advocate throughout.
He seems, he's always struck me as being kind of like the quintessential archetype of the British imperialist.
Oh, absolutely. His biggest belief, his biggest desire was to have a single British colony stretching from the Cape Point in South Africa to Lake Tanganyika in what is now Tanzania. And if he had his way, he would have gone all the way up to Cairo as well. There's famous cartoons you see from Punch and other British magazines from the time, British newspapers, which show him, straddling the continent. It was
the Colossus of Rhodes.
Exactly, yes, that's exactly what it is. And he did his gaze, whilst he was Prime Minister of the Cape Colony, his gaze was always elsewhere, always to the north.
So is this desire to, have the British Empire span from tip to tip of Africa? Is that kind of what really drives him north? What takes him out of that kind of comfortable political life of the Cape Colony?
To be honest, it depends who you talk to, and it depends which sort of sources you read. Everyone likes to give Rhodes, particularly in the sort of controversial climate which his name sort of generates at the moment. Everyone likes to give him different motivations. Some people like to talk about his civilizing intentions, his desire to... there's the famous quote when he says that, you've essentially won, I'm paraphrasing here, but you've essentially won the lottery by being born British, being born white, and it's this idea that depending on what attitude you want to take to him, you can either see him as this great imperialist, or you can see him as a very, very smart businessman who realized that in order to keep expanding, the best way for the British Empire to gain control over central southern Africa was through mining and through this access to new minerals. And
yeah, so logistically, how does he go about moving into the area that is now Zimbabwe?
Well, the first thing is that in 1884 there was the Berlin Conference, which was it's if you do study the scramble for Africa, it's the first thing you'll be taught about. It's this major conference where all the European powers who were interested in the African continent at the time, which they include Britain, France, Portugal, Spain, Germany, Holland, Belgium, and Italy. And as a bit of trivia, the USA and the Ottoman Empire were also present at the conference as observers.
I mean, well, of course, we had Liberia to look after.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. But the thing is, at the Berlin Conference, rules were put down as to how the future of African colonization was going to be carried out. And it's important to note that not a single African was represented at the conference. There was no African voice here. It was the European powers talking amongst themselves about how they were going to carve up this land for themselves. And to get back to how Rhodes goes about is essentially the Berlin Conference meant that to claim new lands, he had to demonstrate that an agreement had been reached with the local African authorities, either a trading agreement or a treaty of friendship. So what Rhodes does is he sends one of his friends and a colleague of his, a man named Charles Rudd, as well as a British missionary named Helm. He sends them to the Ndebele capital of Bulawayo to secure an agreement with the son of Mzilikazi, whose name was Lobengula. And Charles Rudd and Helm, they get this agreement regarding trade and mineral rights to the region, which is called the Rudd Concession. And essentially what the concession does is it forces Lobengula to sign over all of his territory and all of his people to be placed under the control of the British.
Presumably Lobengula was not particularly apprised of this clause in the Rudd Concession.
No, he was tricked. He couldn't read what was written in the document, and he could understand English, but the type of legal jargon which was being presented to him, he didn't fully understand what he was signing away. Essentially, he was told only what he wanted to hear, which was he would be given a substantial amount of guns. He'd be given a gunboat on the Zambezi River. He'd be given some cash. Rudd and Helm made it their mission to boost his, to fan his ego, to boost his reputation as a great leader in the land. And perhaps most interestingly, he was also told that no more than 10 white men would be brought to work in Matabele land.
It's a slight underestimation.
So, this is the Rudd Concession. It's deceit of the highest level. And perhaps most importantly as well, Lobengula signs over the rights to Shona land, the territory to the north, over which he has no control. And when he found out, when he realized what he'd actually signed away, he wrote a petition to Queen Victoria, sort of stating his disagreements, but it went ignored. And a second one he sent was also apparently never delivered. So the result of the Rudd Concession is that in 1888, the BSAC and Cecil Rhodes are given a royal charter by the British Crown on the basis of the rights to all minerals in Matabele land and Shona land. And then the next stage is to demonstrate sort of real control over the land. Rhodes needed to put white settlers in the territory. So in 1889, you get the infamous Pioneer Column, which marches from the Cape Colony to Shona land and occupies the territory there. And so in 1890, you see Fort Salisbury, which is founded, it would become the capital of southern Rhodesia as Salisbury, and is now Harare, the capital of Zimbabwe. And the pioneers are a really interesting sort of case study because they were immortalized in Rhodesian culture. They had a holiday named after them, which was Pioneer Day.
Sounds very wholesome.
Well, the reasons why they were so eager to march the thousands of miles to Shona land was that they were given as much land as they could claim, essentially, about 3,000 acres each, without reference to local Africans, without reference to existing residents on the land.
So presumably, Lobengula had some objections to these more than 10 white men moving into the area.
Yeah, and you see when the pioneers arrive, when you see the settlers arrive, there's sort of sporadic violence between the settlers and the locals. And we're talking sort of here between 1890 and about 1893. You see this sort of building up of resentment, building up of grievances, which the Africans now have against these white settlers. The Africans have their cattle seized. There's taxes levied on them, which they haven't had before. There's, perhaps most embarrassingly, there's accusations of trespassing leveled at Africans who've lived on these lands, in the case of the Shona, for 2,000, 3,000 years. And this all builds up, and it builds up, and in 1893, you see this violence used as an excuse to destroy the Ndebele state in its centralized form. And the trigger for this, what would become known as either the first Matabele Wars, the first Chimurenga, or the Umvukela War. The trigger for this is a sort of conflict between Ndebele and the Shona-speaking village near to a settler town. And you see in the letters from the time, you see in the reports of missionaries in the area that the BSAC, who are in control of the region, who are ostensibly in control of the region, they claim this is, an indication of the uncontrollable sort of tribalism of the Ndebele. The Ndebele are inherently violent, and it will be impossible to build a successful state while the Ndebele still have some means of power. And of course, like we were talking about a few moments ago, the rumors of gold in Matabele land, of course, played a part as well. And so in 1893, you see this settler army under another of Rhodes's friends, Dr. Leander Starr Jameson. You see him march against the Ndebele. You see them attack and capture the Ndebele capital. And you see Lobengula flee. And essentially, with the destruction of the Ndebele state, you see white settlers move into Matabele land and divide it up amongst themselves.
Now, famously, this is, as I was doing my background research, this seemed to be the first time that the Maxim guns, the early forms of machine guns, are really kind of the first time they were employed.
Yeah, and you particularly see it again 3 years later in 1896 when the violence builds up again. And this time you see the second Matabele War, which is, I suppose, more properly, this would be the first Chimurenga in Shona.
And what is the significance of Chimurenga?
Chimurenga is essentially it's a Shona word meaning essentially it means resistance. It's this idea of a unified social movement, violent movement. And in 1896, you see this Chimurenga, you see this violence spread across huge swathes of Matabele land and Mashona land. And you see the whites the settlers forced back to the fortified lagers, which they can defend with Maxim guns.
Now, for those of us not familiar, when you say lagers, you're not referring to them, I don't know, I guess going and getting a nice beer.
No, lagers, it's an Afrikaner word. It's a term. It's essentially a well-defended small area. You see them in the Boer Wars. You see them throughout African colonization, especially in southern Africa. You see these lagers being the sort of last stand of white settlers. And in Matabele land, you see Bulawayo become this fortified lager where the white settlers feel secure enough in their own numbers. And
now this kind of mass uprising, is that being led by Lusaweo or his successor, or I mean, who's leading this kind of rebellion against white incursion?
Well, again, this is another sort of interesting topic because there's been huge academic debates about the uprisings in 1896 and 1897. There's been it was quite surprising that the Ndebele and the Shona both joined in attacking the settlers, because as far as the settlers were concerned, both ethnic groups hated each other as much as they did the settlers. So you see in the sort of late 1970s, you see this debate between historians of Africa about why the violence spread the way it did, and you see people like Terence Ranger who argued that it was a religious group called the Mwari cult who sort of organize and control the violence through their network of influential religious leaders. But then you see other historians like Julian Cobbing and David Beach who argue that this is giving too much credit. Ranger was writing a history in the late 1960s designed to provide African nationalists at the time with a historical backing. So you see Cobbing and Beach, you see them turn around and say, no, it was simply African grievances which saw the Shona join in with the Ndebele. And this is still a debate which goes on today. You see it in academic circles that it is still a much discussed topic, because obviously in the 1896-1897 uprisings, there are not only mass motivations, but individual reasons as well. So it's quite a difficult sort of question to answer.
To get down to the bare facts, it does not succeed.
No, you get the arrival of reinforcements from the Cape colony. Rhodes sends up soldiers, including Cape Coloreds, who are black or mixed race South African troops. They all get sent up. They put down the rebellions in an incredibly brutal way. There's about 450 whites were killed in the uprisings, which is about 10% of the settler population at the time. So it was a devastating war, but there are no statistics for the amounts of Africans killed. The best guess would probably put it at about several thousand, including women and children, because of the way the Europeans suppressed the rebellion. They dynamited caves, which Ndebele and Shona people were hiding in. They executed leaders. They executed men of fighting age. It's the same story you see across Africa, is that any sort of violent resistance is met with unprecedented brutality. And the 1896-1897 rebellions, although they're not successful, they are nonetheless significant because they mark the last major resistance movement by Africans in the area in Rhodesia until the 1960s.
At this point, we essentially have what we would consider a colonial government at that point. So, under the aegis of this British South African company, but what was their goal there? It's kind of purely to extract wealth and send it back to Europe. Was it furthering this idea of building this transcontinental connection from Cape Town to Cairo? Were there attempts to kind of bring in and the Shona and the Ndebele people into kind of European civilization? How did they, there was no more rebellions against them, so how did they utilize this time?
Well, in 1898, Rhodesia's officially recognised as a unified chartered territory of the British South Africa Company. So, as far as they are concerned, Rhodesia, which also at this time includes northern Rhodesia, which is now Zambia, as far as the BSAC are concerned, the next sort of quarter of a century are focused on maximizing profits. You see this gradual expansion of agricultural production. You see mining enterprises pop up across the country. And the way they go about it is you see towns develop around the military posts, which, Fort Salisbury, Fort Victoria, you see these become recognized towns. You see a major railway line running from South Africa through Rhodesia to Mozambique. You see roads which were, until quite late in the period, until 1920s, often nothing more than dirt tracks. You see these things take precedence. You see this building up of infrastructure in a bid to, like I said, maximize profits for the company, because at this time, the region is still a chartered territory. It's still governed by the shareholders of the BSAC. I mean, it wasn't all smooth sailing. The BSAC government had initially hoped that mining would form the backbone of the Rhodesian economy and thus earn them the sort of profits they saw in South Africa. This belief that Rhodesia would become the second Rand of the region. This belief collapsed in the 1890s and the late 1890s when the settlers realized that gold wasn't lying on the surface, that it was actually quite a difficult and expensive job to get these minerals out. So what you see is a shift towards an agricultural economy. You see this sort of shift to a farming community. And it wasn't an easy conversion. By 1898, you only have about 250 white farmers in the country, and many of them are not doing very much cultivation. I think it would probably be better to actually just call them traders, because they bartered with the farming Africans. They
had the connections to move crops to other markets, I guess you could say.
Yeah, and you see many white settlers sell their plots to big companies, big agricultural companies who buy up the land for very cheap. You see many white settlers just leave, and you see in the sort of early 1900s, you see this build-up of big economic farming companies. And there's a few reasons why agriculture became sort of not only a popular economy in South Africa, in Rhodesia, but also why it became a profitable one. And we have to talk about other factors in the region. You know, the South African Anglo-Boer Wars around the turn of the century had a huge impact upon imports from South Africa to the region. So, as well as, you know, you get these outbreaks of cattle diseases such as rinderpest and East Coast fever. And what all this does is it enforces a quarantine of livestock and crops in the region. So the result is a new major domestic market in Rhodesia opens up just as South African competition is excluded. And so you see this huge sort of sudden surge after 1900. You see this huge growth in both white population, but also in the agricultural and the rural sort of farmers.
No, Zimbabwe or Rhodesia at that time, well, it's still at that time, the area is landlocked. So I mean, when they're you know, exporting these agricultural goods or even the mining products, I mean, are these going down through the Cape Colony and out through there, or is it going out because at this point on either side it's bounded by Portuguese colonies, correct? You know, there's Mozambique to the east and then Angola to the west, correct?
Well, you've actually got Mozambique to the west. You've got Zambia to the north, or northern Rhodesia at that point. You've got Botswana to the south, and then you've got Namibia to the east. You've got these. It is landlocked. It is surrounded by other colonies, and the majority of their produce actually remains in the country, in the domestic market. You see, up until about 1914, you see 90% of the sort of total marketed output is not only coming from African cultivators, but it's remaining within the country. You know, it's feeding the settler population. You're seeing this gradual increase in cash crops such as maize and tobacco. But for the first quarter of the 20th century, for the first few decades, the main sort of focus is first of all to get crops down to South Africa if possible, but to build up a white population in the region. So you see the white population grow from 11 to about 23,000 in about 10 years, which is to us, it probably doesn't seem a huge increase, but at the time you're talking about a population doubling in less than a decade.
Yeah, so how are relations with the Ndebele and the Shona?
Well, at this point, the white settlers, the BSAC in particular, they're dependent upon rural African smallholders. The white population can't feed itself. The white farmers, of which there's probably about 2,000 or so in 1914, they're too busy trying to make money from cash crops. They, don't want to waste their own money, trying to feed themselves. So they are buying these crops from African cultivators. And what you see is the chartered states government, the BSAC's government, it begins to shift policies to try and weaken traditional African production. In 1904 you get the Rhodesian Agricultural Union formed, and this union, it's a whites only union, and it attacks the priority given to both mining and to African peasant farming. So you see the big companies I mentioned earlier, which are buying up land as the white settlers leave. They are now given a sort of state support to protect protect the white farmers from having to compete with the Africans in the nation. And this is the beginning of, by destroying the independent African farmer and putting food production into the hands of the whites, you're seeing the settlers' sort of state appearing in the form it would take for the next 100 years. You're seeing this forcing of the African population into wage labor. You're strengthening industrial development. And as a result, you see the segregation of the African population as a whole.
Yeah. So one of the general patterns of colonialism is to kind of exploit existing differences between the indigenous people and to kind of co-opt their leadership as well, or if they can't be co-opted, be undermined. Is that kind of what's happening here? I mean, are we seeing power shift from kind of the traditional Ndebele and Shona authorities more directly into the Rhodesian government?
Yeah, at this time, the Rhodesian government is very, very, very much focused on essentially trying to keep the African population as docile as possible and trying to remove them from interacting with the whites more than necessary. The Ndebele society as a whole had been severely damaged in terms of a unified political leadership by the 1893 and 1896-97 rebellions, and many of the political leaders had been executed. Many of the strong sort of leadership families had been removed from positions of power. I think it's probably worthwhile just mentioning that the Ndebele and the Shona were both dependent upon cattle as means of economic status and political status. And what you see is, by removing cattle from the sort of traditional authorities, like you were saying, it weakens their authority within their own societies. And you see in sort of between 1904 and 1910, you see this beginning of a co-option of what the BSAC and what the settler state like to call the traditional chiefs, the chieftaincies, the sort of social leaders. You see them beginning to be brought into the fold. They're given the vote, which is a remarkable thing because for the next 60 years, they were the only Africans who were permitted to vote without having to qualify for the franchise. So you're absolutely right in that it was a case of trying to shift traditional authority, or authority more generally, from the traditional social structures to the settler state as a whole.
And presumably the use of what had been pastoral lands for agriculture at this point also kind of undermines that traditional source of wealth and authority, and having these immensely large herds. Yeah,
you see this policy from quite early on. You see this policy of forcing out the indigenous African population into segregated reserves, and these reserves are away from the main railway links and markets. They're on land with poorer soil and less rainfall, which reduces their ability to farm productively. And what you see is the BSAC had put land aside for the Africans from fairly early on. It had always been an intention of Rhodes to segregate the country. And the BSAC puts aside probably about 18 million acres, which is just under half the total land area of southern Rhodesia. And they forcibly relocate the African...
Half, but I mean, we did say that the numbers of these British settlers were slightly less than half of the population.
Yeah, by the start of World War I, 3% of the population controlled 75% of the land, and 97% of the population, which are the African population, are forced onto only a quarter of the territory. And you see this once African-owned, really fertile lands being sold to white settlers for incredibly small sums. And it is the Native Reserves Commission and its segregatory policies. It defines the country. It defines how social relations, it defines how the economy is going to work. And it's comparable to South Africa in terms of the homeland schemes, and also how the racial divisions in South Africa were formed at the time.
We're going to get to talking about kind of a comparison of social policy in Rhodesia and South Africa shortly, but you had mentioned World War I, and famously, of course, that was kind of World War I and World War II were the 1-2 punch to the British Empire that kind of brought it toppling down. But what was Rhodesia's involvement in this?
Well, World War I, played a significant role in shaping national identity in Rhodesia. 40% of the adult male population saw active service, which is the highest enlistment rate in the British Empire.
And this is 40% of the white settler population.
The white settler population, sorry. Meanwhile, the Rhodesia Native Regiment voluntarily enlisted about 2,500 African soldiers, and Rhodesian troops, black and white, fought in German Southwest Africa as well as on the Western Front. And both groups of soldiers were recognized by Britain, by Germany, by most of the European powers for their bravery, for their marksmanship, for their sort of respectability as representatives of the British Empire. And it sees the territory, it sees Rhodesia held in good stead for decades to come. World War One cements this idea of service to the motherland as a prevalent theme of white Rhodesian culture. And you see this for decades. You see this idea that the Rhodesian settlers, the white men and women, they see themselves as the most loyal British subjects, despite, residing in a land thousands of miles away.
Yeah, and of course, also, shortly after World War One, Rhodesia was kind of officially annexed into the British Empire, correct?
Yeah, in 1922, you get this referendum where the white settlers get to decide whether they want to become part of the Union of South Africa or a self-governing colony. And because of how, this sort of jingoistic nationalism born out of World War One, the majority vote for becoming a self-governing colony. And so in 1923, you get the colony of Southern Rhodesia born as we know it today. As Zimbabwe is today, it has the same borders, it has the major towns, it has the urban centers and the economy and everything else which would, when you're talking about Zimbabwe or Southern Rhodesia, it was born from this 1923 sort of formation, really.
Now, after this, creation of, what is now basically the blueprint for the modern state of Zimbabwe, do we see a change in policy in the interwar period, or is it still primarily just focused on this kind of mercantile business of expanding the economy?
Yeah, but between 1923 and sort of 1940, you do see, despite the removal of their charter territory status, very little changes in terms of policy, in terms of politics, or in terms of economy, both for the white settlers and for the oppressed African majority. White immigration booms after World War One, and you see the white population double to about 50,000 by 1930s. After World War II, you see another huge rush of European immigrants, which jumps to about, the white population jumps to about 140,000, which, bear in mind, is still less than 5% of the total population. But as far as the white settlers are concerned, it's now a respectable settler state. But racial segregation continues. The Prime Minister from 1934 through World War II, and after, Godfrey Huggins, he comes up with this idea of something called the two pyramids approach, which is this concept that the two main races, blacks and whites, can coexist in the country, but have very little interaction or competition with each other. And I mean, the two pyramids approach is quite interesting because it, as far as Huggins was concerned, it does two things. It counters the threat of African economic competition to European settler production. The Great Depression of 1929 to about 1931 had a really bad impact on white farmers and white laborers. And so as a result of this sort of racial segregation, the state basically enforces levies on the African farmers to prevent them from being able to compete with the white agriculturalists. African produce, for example, is only on sale in the domestic market at a really very, very, very reduced price compared to European counterparts. The Africans have to pay higher taxes on cattle, higher transport costs for their crops, for getting them to market.
Now, there was already an existing tax called the hut tax, right? Or does that come later?
No, the hut tax was introduced very early on before the 1893 rebellions, and it's often seen as one of the reasons why African grievances were so sort of widespread and so prevalent. And the hut tax didn't discriminate. All Africans were subject to it. And that's just one of many, many taxes which were sort of racially divisive in their own manner. You have sort of beer taxes, because essentially European liquor was forbidden for the African population. So Africans took to brewing their own beers, and as a new means of revenue, as a new means of sort of controlling the settler state taxes, beer, it taxes cattle very heavily. It forces Africans to pay comparatively enormous fees for just being able to sell their own products in European markets. And it's this segregation. It should also be pointed out, perhaps, that this racial segregation was designed to combat something which Europeans called the Black Peril, which is this fear that white civilization.
Sorry, it's kind of a comical name.
It's pretty awful in terms of the amount of literature you see. You see novels written on this Black Peril, which is this idea that white civilization would be undermined and destroyed by any contact with the uncivilized African masses. And you mentioned the Portuguese colonies sort of on the continent at the time of Mozambique and Angola. And it's interesting to compare how Portugal and Britain approached controlling their sort of subjects, their African subjects. The Portuguese were huge fans of interracial sort of miscegenation. The assimilation, I suppose you'd call it, is this idea that by I'm trying to think how to phrase this. Well,
I would say that really, I believe Paulo Freire. Anyway, Freire in Brazil would later coin the term specifically for Brazil, but it kind of also applies to these Portuguese colonies as well. The idea of a racial democracy.
And
you have Vasconcelos in Mexico talking about La Raza Cosmica. This idea of a new race of people kind of arising.
Yeah, and that's what you see in the Portuguese colonies, is you see this idea of sort of racial mixing as being beneficial to both groups, the colonizers and the colonized. But in Britain, the British migrants in southern Rhodesia, they see racial mixing as being dangerous. They see it as being a damaging sort of feature. They believe that only when Africans have been responsibly civilized and brought up to a suitable level of culture should they be allowed to interact with the white population as equals.
Yeah, so I know that in South Africa, official apartheid would come later than in this period that we're talking about, this kind of interwar period. But I mean, it sounds very much like this was kind of an unofficial policy of what we would call apartheid. But I mean, were there official policies that, if you were African, you couldn't be in this area after a certain time, you couldn't, go and you couldn't go into certain towns, you had restrictions on movement, things like that?
You do. You see the codification of sort of social and racial segregation beginning in the interwar period, particularly in terms of sort of the 1930 Land Apportionment Act, which is perhaps the most notable piece of legislature to appear in southern Rhodesia before the Second World War. And essentially what the Land Apportionment Act does is it divides all land in the colony along racial lines, and into specific categories. So you see these, European lands which Africans can't buy. You see African purchase lands for those Africans who could afford to buy their own land. And then you see the tribal trust lands, which are the African reserves under a new name. And the result is you see, over half the total land given to a white population of about 50,000, while over 1 million Africans are given essentially about a third of the total land mass.
So, World War II then, of course, comes along, and how does that change things in what was in Rhodesia, or southern Rhodesia, I guess you'd say?
Yeah, the Second World War provides a significant distraction to.
Yeah, you might call it that. Yes.
Yeah,
World War II, a significant distraction.
That's it does it much as in the First World War. You see Rhodesians quickly and eagerly mobilize. This strong sense of national and patriotic duty to the metropole of Britain. You see them eager to prove once again that they are the best of the British. And you see this. Perhaps most notably, you get the Rhodesian Air Training Group, which is a flying school established in the colony to train fighter pilots for the Royal Air Force. And it's established there simply because the Rhodesian weather is a great environment for new pilots to learn. Particularly during the winter months, and you're getting clear skies, and it's
because
essentially
it has a wet dry season, right? And then in the winter it's dry and clear.
Yeah, during the summer, you get in November and December you see rain pretty much every afternoon. But during the winter, it's dry, it's clear, and also it's far away from potential bombing raids. So you don't get the same potential destruction of training crafts and training planes and everything else. But as well as the Rhodesian training group, the air training group, you also see Rhodesian troops fighting across the world. They see combat in Kenya and in the Horn of Africa. They see combat in North Africa and in the Middle East, including at El Alamein. They fight in Italy, in the Balkans, in Greece. African troops from the Rhodesian African Rifles, which was a mixture of volunteers and conscripts. They saw combat in Burma. Meanwhile, Rhodesian pilots and airmen who would...
You mentioned conscripts as well. I mean, was there a reaction, a rebellion? Because I know that oftentimes when you see people who do not want to go fight for something that they don't see as their fight, they tend to take poorly to being conscripted.
There was some localized resistance movements, but it wasn't violent. It was more, you'd see the occasional protests from families, from the young men who are being forced to go off and fight.
But nothing like widespread and organized.
No, you don't see. As I say, there was Southern Rhodesia in the 1960s was famous for saying we haven't had to use the police to put down rebellion since 1896. So you don't see the sort of the same scenes you'd see in India or other British colonies, where mass conscription does trigger this sort of political resistance to the war effort on the whole. You don't get the same thing in Rhodesia.
Yeah, but World War II significantly, of course, brought about at least the start of the end of empire, of pretty much all the European empires. But it led into a period of decolonization. So, how did that wave sweep over Rhodesia?
Yeah, like you mentioned, in the British Empire, more generally in empires across the world, the Second World War fundamentally changed the way the African majority viewed their relationship with the white settler state. There's a variety of reasons. You can talk about the fact they were fighting side by side of white and black troops. The realization that Africans had, upon seeing how poor whites were treated in Europe. You can talk about as well the fact that they saw white men killing other white men, and thus not being the infallible beings they were brought up to regard them as. And you're absolutely right that all these factors begin to give rise to an African desire for an end to colonial rule. The white state realizes this very early on in the aftermath of the war. You see riots in urban areas in the late 1940s. And so the white state begins to shift its policy from the two pyramids approach I mentioned earlier to something which you'd call paternalist partnership, which I suppose simply put means that whites and Africans could be working together for the betterment of both, but with whites in positions of power and Africans striving to reach civilization under the tutelage of their white leaders. This is all incredibly racialist terminology. It's all an incredibly racialist policy. But as far as the white settler state was concerned, this was the best policy for the African population as a whole. And then you get Prime Minister Huggins, who undermines the entire thing by comparing this multiracialism as this multiracial relationship as being akin to the partnership between a horse and its rider.
Was he undermining it to because presumably, of course, these local African leaders who had been kind of brought into the fold, they saw this as a benefit. Of course, now it sounds like they would having more participation generally in Rhodesian society, and it sounds like this idea of like, oh yeah, no, we're actually fulfilling this idea of this colonial white man's burden now. So, I mean, who did he ruin it for? Did he ruin it for the Africans who are going to be presenting or who are going to be taking part in this, the world watching Rhodesia, or did he ruin it for Rhodesians themselves?
I think through statements like that, Huggins himself was a proponent of this multiracial partnership, but I think he simply saw it as a way of postponing the majority rule, which was beginning to form across the nation. This desire for self-government by the African majority for the African majority. So you do see this multiracial intent sort of undermined by this comment, and by this sort of, you see it undermined perhaps more rigorously through the fact that more laws are brought in to divide the population further. In 1947, you get the Native Urban Areas Accommodation Act, which splits towns into African and European sections. From 1947 onwards, Africans aren't allowed to reside in European sections unless they're working for a white family as a maid or a domestic servant. And meanwhile, Europeans aren't allowed in the African areas, to buy houses and so on. And you see other rules. You see town location regulations. You see native urban location ordinances. You see all these laws which make it illegal for Africans to be in European areas outside of working hours without a signed pass from a white authority, either an employer or a policeman or the local.
So Hutchinson's comments were basically just kind of helping to expose the lie both of the practice and the intent of these policies.
Exactly. Yeah, you do. You see these laws undermine everything which multiracial partnership is supposed to espouse, and the wider world and the African continent and the African population in Rhodesia realize this. And you perhaps most sort of visibly see this in voting qualifications. And I touched upon earlier the fact that African chiefs were given the vote from a very early stage. And voting qualifications for the rest of the population in the post-Second World War period, the African, the voting qualifications generally were semantically, they were non-racial. Anybody was eligible to vote if they met the requirements needed.
And what were these requirements?
They were essentially unattainable by the African population. The example, to be specific, the average salary of an African labourer during this period was about 80 Rhodesian pounds a year. To be able to vote, you needed 800 Rhodesian pounds a year. So although these, the enfranchisement qualifications are supposedly non-racial, they are worded and set up in such a way that it is only the white population and the wealthiest and sort of most elite Africans who are able to vote. And this causes a bit of backlash because you do see some poor whites lose their voting rights because of this. But it's one of those sort of positions where I suppose the Rhodesian government argued, it's for the greater good. A few white not being able to vote is worth this non-racial stance.
Yeah, but even though some whites lost the vote, the electorate was overwhelmingly white.
Yeah, you're talking essentially less than 0.0001% of the African population was eligible to vote, compared to over 75% of the white population. And when you bear in mind the fact the African population is so enormously large compared to the European settler, the white settler population, it makes the electorate, it makes the parliament, it makes all of these things essentially tools of the settler state.
Now, in the early 50s, there's this creation which melds southern Rhodesia, what was then northern Rhodesia, and I believe it was called Nyasaland at that point, modern Malawi, into something called the Central African Federation. So, what was the cause behind this kind of political formation?
Well, this is the Central African Federation, or otherwise known as the Federation of Rhodesia and Nyasaland. it's the most evident portrayal of this multiracial partnership. It's meant to be this idea that in 1953, so when Southern Rhodesia joined the other two British colonies, it was this idea that the three territories could prosper more fully as one cohesive block than as individual entities. To put it very, very, very simply, the basic sort of intent was that Nyasaland would provide the workers, much as it had been doing for decades now. You know, there'd been a free bus route from Nyasaland to Southern Rhodesia for anybody wanting to migrate to work, any Africans wanting to migrate to work, since the 1930s. But Nyasaland would provide the workers, Northern Rhodesia would provide the raw materials, the copper, the iron, the gold in some cases. And then Southern Rhodesia would provide the leadership and the agriculture. You know, it would be the breadbasket of this little sort of triangle of each working off their own strengths and supporting the other's weaknesses. You know, this relationship between the regions had been in place informally since the 1900s, since the early 1900s. So in many ways, it's simply the federation is simply a sort of consolidation of existing.
It's a formalization of what was already there.
Yeah, existing trade routes and labor migration. It's essentially just putting these all down in a more solid form. And the federal government is created, which is designed to oversee all three territories. But it's essentially a Southern Rhodesian apparatus in everything but name. You know, there's a smattering of African MPs.
Yeah, so what were the demographics at that point in Nyasaland and that point Northern Rhodesia? I mean, did they have this kind of similar setup of a tiny, less than 5% European minority, ruling over, a tremendous African majority?
Yeah, it's comparable. Northern Rhodesia never had the same sort of mass immigration of whites that Southern Rhodesia had, and Nyasaland is somewhere in between the two of them. Northern Rhodesia was very much seen as a working colony. It was very much seen as a source of labor and minerals. So
even today, Zambia is very famous, for a very famous mining area.
Yeah, the copper belt in southern southern Zambia. It determined. It was one of the reasons the federation came about, is that Southern Rhodesia wanted more control over the copper there.
Yeah, but it sounds like that by incorporating this larger political entity, that it seems like the European ruling minority in Rhodesia just made themselves an even smaller minority.
Yeah, the thing is, what they did, although they did sort of sacrifice their numerical minority by, like you say, making it even smaller, there was never any. The Federation never had the sort of incredibly close relationship which was perhaps expected under a name of the Central African Federation. There was never Southern Rhodesia remained in control throughout, and the Southern Rhodesian settlers remained in control throughout until sort of the late 1950s, when the Federation began to collapse.
Yeah, so in 1960, of course, we see a wave, really a huge wave of decolonization across all of Africa. And unfortunately, that is where we will be leaving it off with this episode, ending on the cliffhanger of how Rhodesia will deal with entering, or, as we shall learn, struggling to not enter the post-colonial age. But I hope this episode has given you a little bit of insight into a country that, again, as I mentioned at the beginning, is often used as a symbol for a lot of other things, as opposed to simply being understood on its own terms, in a way that is probably be more helpful to the conversation than talking about it in abstracts as proxies and stand-ins for much larger arguments. Particularly when we see that, the breadbasket of Africa has really kind of been, a very prosperous breadbaskety kind of region for, something like 3,000 years. It becomes a little strange to just simply take it as if it miraculously came into being, that though this area had not even existed until somewhere around, the late 19th century. But that's kind of a problem kind of endemic to talking about really any kind of country in the post-colonial world, really, but Africa in particular.
So coming up in part 2, we'll start from where we left off at kind of that post-colonial onset, that wave. If you've ever looked at independent states in countries in Sub-Saharan Africa, you'll see that 1960 was kind of a watershed year, and the years after it as well. So we'll be picking up from there and moving almost kind of up into the modern era and talking more about the formation of Zimbabwe and how the internal politics of that country played out as well. But that is actually going to have to wait because, unfortunately, I have a very sad announcement about the podcast, is that it's going to be going on a hiatus, unfortunately. For 1 whole week. Yes, instead of 2-week break, we will be taking a 3-week break. So, as you may or may not know, depending on your nationality and or familiarity with American customs, America will be celebrating Thanksgiving. That's a national holiday on the 26th of November. And so just kind of coordination, scheduling, all sorts of other things. It's typically a holiday where people travel too much and eat far too much as well. So it's a very American holiday. And I will be doing both of those things, so we're going to be pushing back the publication date of part 2 just by a week. So hopefully you won't have to wait too long to find out what happens to Rhodesia. Although, please don't look ahead. You don't want to spoil the surprise. So until then, please rate and review us on iTunes, or whatever you happen to rate and review podcasts on. Feel free to plug us wherever you want to plug us. If people want a podcast recommendation, we're here for them. If people want a history recommendation, we're here for them as well. Really, it's very always comforting to see our listenership numbers kind of creep up and climb up between episodes and just over time. And of course, as always, feel free to come by the discussion post and ask any follow-up questions you have about this period of time in Southern Africa, about Rhodesia, about Zimbabwe, although you may be getting ahead of us there, and we may be covering that in part 2, or anything about the podcast in general. Until then, thank you for listening, and we'll see you in 3 weeks.
You've been listening to the Ask Historians podcast. For more history like this, visit us at reddit.com/r/AskHistorians and ask over 100 historians and enthusiasts anything you wanted to know in history. Find us on Twitter as @AskHistorians and subscribe to the show on iTunes. Or visit askhistorians.libsyn.com. Thank you very much for listening, and join us next time on the Ask Historians podcast.